This is American Government, Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. Next, we'll take up Wilson Chapter 11 on the bureaucracy. But today we'll finish up with the presidency in the sense of considering the major criticisms and controversies about the contemporary presidency. Many people criticize the presidency when they don't like the occupant of the office or his or her policies. And I add this as a caution before we begin, because you always have to be careful about criticizing institutions because you don't like what the occupants or the institutions are doing. It's a mistake the particular kind of mistake is that's a mistake of thinking of mixing up short range and long range issues. Um, Sometimes institutional change is necessary, of course. That's what brought the Constitution into being. But many times, partisanship and contemporary issues blur people's minds and oftentimes get them to think about changing the fundamental institutions or processes of an institution when, in fact, their real complaint is with the policies or the occupants. In some ways, I believe that's the case with the Electoral College. Oftentimes, whether or not you're for or against the abolition of the Electoral College depends upon whether the outcome of the electoral vote matches the individual whom you supported for the presidency. Um, so, in some ways, I think that's true of the presidency too. And as an example of this, by the way, of this changing institutional structures or processes to meet partisan ends. An example of that is, in some ways, one that's taking place in our contemporary times. Harry Reid, who used to be the majority leader of the Senate when the Democrats controlled the Senate under President Obama's first couple of years in office, persuaded the Democrats in the Senate to abandon the filibuster for judicial nominations. And to the applause, as I mentioned, of Democrats then, because it accelerated President Obama's judicial nominations through the Senate, and to the dismay of Democrats today, because it enabled President Trump to accelerate his nominees during his term. So I think one has to be very careful about criticisms of an institution and its processes or structures for that reason. Nevertheless, for several decades now, um, after the rapid expansion of presidential power in this century, and the sort of normalization of the Hamiltonian presidency, as I suggested in my last lecture, um, there are three enduring criticisms. One, interestingly enough, is the president too powerful? The second one, interestingly enough, is the president too weak? Is the job too big for the office as it currently exists in our constitutional system? And the third one, of course, is the president too popular? Um, so let's look at the first criticism. Has the crisis power of the president expanded the presidency to the point where the office is unchecked? What is the crisis power, the emergency power of the president? Lincoln gives a good example of this during the Civil War, when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in order to detain people who might obstruct the war effort without the benefit of civil trial. In Article 1, Section 9, it says, and remember, Article 1, Section 9 limits Congress's powers. So, Article 1, Section 9 says the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in times of insurrection or rebellion. Now, of course, that's what the Civil War was. But of course, if you think about it, this would suggest that it's a congressional decision since this is in the limitation on Congress's powers. Lincoln was aware of this, um, and he did in fact suspend presidentially the writ of habeas corpus in Indiana, which was still in the Union, by the way, and to shut down the activity of Confederate sympathizers. Now, when people attacked him for exercising dictatorial powers, for using as president a power that Congress was clearly intended under the Constitution, he wrote a letter explaining this. I didn't sign this letter, but if you want to take a look at it, it's short, and he argues that it may be necessary to bend a part of the Constitution to save the whole of the Constitution. and that in wartime and crisis, things might be constitutional that were not constitutional or would not be constitutional in times of peace. Now, this is a dangerous argument, but I would say it's more or less the argument that the nation has accepted. And it would be something like this: if there's a natural desire, like a disaster, like a hurricane or or an earthquake or something, and martial law is declared, most people would support that, even though it means a radical limitation of their freedoms, at least temporarily, because of the nature of the crisis. They wouldn't, on the other hand, support that kind of exertion of authority in peaceful times. So, in some ways, the idea that the Constitution would be more flexible in times of crisis or war, especially when it comes to the president's authority, is probably a settled doctrine in some ways in our constitutional system. And during times of war, presidents have, in fact, exercised remarkable discretion. So, um, some might suggest the problem is that because of our involvement in international affairs and the fact that we have, I believe, at last count, over 900 military bases throughout the world, um, that we're in a constant state of emergency and crisis, and that therefore that being in a state of emergency crisis has what's expanded the president's powers. So we arrive at the question: is the president's power unchecked? Many people believe that President Trump threatens the possibility of dictatorship. Now, believe me, it's possible to have intense dislike for President Trump or any president. I'm a partisan, and I've had my partisan dislikes and loves of the occupant of the White House, um, or even believe that he is unfit to occupy the office of the presidency. Um, Now, I have to say that even if you were of that opinion, those who advocate the abolition of the Electoral College or the two-party system should reflect that the abolition of either would probably break down the final restraints on the purely popular or populist candidate and would probably elevate even more candidates like President Trump to the presidency. I think that Caesar has a point in his essay that we read on party reform and constitutional principle, that the unintended consequences of the modern reformers to create a purely popular system of nominating and electing the president probably had consequences that they did not fully anticipate. But whatever one thinks of President Trump, um, he would be probably the first one to admit that his power is hardly unchecked either by Congress or the courts. Um, Ever since he took office, several of his major initiatives have been stopped by congressional limitation or by the courts shutting down his policies. I would agree with President Trump that his powers are hardly unlimited. Kevin Burns would too, I think, in his essay on presidential discretion and constitutional rhetoric. I think Burns contrasts two views of the relationship of presidential powers to the Constitution. The first, by President Theodore Roosevelt, is often called the Stewardship Theory of the Presidency. And according to Roosevelt, the president derives his core power as steward of the public good rather than from specific grants of power in the Constitution. He would suggest that this would suggest that modern presidents, insofar as they follow this theory, really are not limited by the Constitution, but rather by what the people will approve or disapprove of. Many scholars of the presidency, there is a whiff of Wilson's discussion of contemporary presidential power in Chapter 10 of this, also support this theory, or did up until the Vietnam War. Many disapprove of it, such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who, I've mentioned this book several times, The Imperial Presidency, published in 1974, came to believe that this would lead to the president becoming an emperor, or has led to the president becoming an emperor, unrestrained by the constitutional system. Burns then goes on to contrast the other main view of presidential power, that offered by William Howard Taft, who was president right after Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been the vice president of William McKinley, who was then assassinated and became president at the beginning of the 20th century. and was reelected. And his vice president, William Howard Taft, became president after him. But then, interestingly enough, after Taft was defeated by Woodrow Wilson in the election of 1912, then he was appointed to the Supreme Court sometime later, and is the only individual actually to have served as the head of two branches of the national government. Um, so um, uh, Taft is the source of the other view that presidential power is and should be essentially linked to grants of power inside the Constitution. Um, Now it's and of course Roosevelt was aware of this and criticized this as the weak or the passive president. But Burns's point, and I think he is correct about this, and Taft's point is that when you read the president's powers in the Constitution flexibly and broadly, like Hamilton, um, that they are sufficient to allow the president to meet any national challenge or crisis. This also was Lincoln's position. Um, it is, I also believe, the correct reading of the president's powers today. Moreover, presidents quickly discovered that the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances do erect formidable barriers to unbridled presidential discretion. The president is the most powerful executive in the world, that's true. But she is not an emperor or an empress. And the channeled popular responsibility, which Hamilton describes in Federalist 70 that we considered, that channeled popular responsibility through the Electoral College, and as Caesar would point out, through the party system as Van Buren developed it and as it has dominated most of our presidential politics. By the way, holding up the possibility of reelection does or does not force the president to explain presidential policies to the people and nation. So um, I think it's incorrect to try to see the president's powers deriving from some broad residuum of authority that's not within the Constitution. And when one views the president's powers broadly within the constitutional system, I think it leads to the conclusion, at least in my opinion, and Burns's, etc., that the president is both powerful and checked, powerful and restrained by the constitutional system at the same time. But the second criticism, interestingly enough, goes off in the other direction. And this suggests that the president's too weak or that the job is too big, the responsibilities, that we've come to pile so many expectations onto the contemporary presidency that it's beyond the capacity of any one person to manage its responsibilities or to do well. So some argue that the executive branch is so large that it can't be supervised coherently. Or Wilson Chen in Chapter 10, interestingly enough, in the section on the demands of the jobs, may come close to suggesting this, or that Congress is so diffuse and chained by special interests, sort of like a Fiorino view of Congress, that the president cannot lead or provide the kind of legislative leadership that Kennedy talks about in his campaign speech, or that the scope and demands of the presidency, such as managing the economy, um, uh, are too big for any one individual to manage coherently. As we have seen with Congress, some authors suggest the necessity of revising the separation of powers. Some have suggested a partial adoption of the presidential prime minister system so that the president might control the internal workings of Congress more effectively, or that certain aspects of administration might be divided between a president and a prime minister. But overcoming the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances does threaten to uncontain presidential power, and the unity of the executive at the top of the executive branch does, I believe, encourage responsibility and accountability. And to some degree, whether or not it's possible for any single individual to master the remarkable demands of the presidency depends, of course, somewhat upon the occupant of the office. Um, Again, I may have mentioned this before. I have mentioned before that historians and political scientists uh, divide and rank and rate the 45 occupants of the office into 5 categories of great, near great, middling, poor, and failed, and also from best to worst. Um, as I already mentioned, only about 5 presidents fall into the great category typically. And this, by the way, this was interestingly enough, rating and ranking of the presidents by contemporary historians and political scientists that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. initiated in 1962 when President Kennedy was still president before he had been assassinated. And interestingly enough, he lived to be quite old, into his 90s. And in 1982, he recommissioned the same study. And after he passed away, it was done in 2002 again, in 2017. And it's interesting that over 5 decades, 6, 7 decades, that scholars and political scientists still pretty much agree on. Now, some presidents gone up and down as historical distances kind of changed in evaluation of a presidency, but it's interesting. Of the 5 great presidents, uh, as in 62, 82, 2002, and 2017, most would agree that that Abraham Lincoln is the greatest president, uh, and that right behind him is George Washington, and right behind him FDR, and right behind him either Teddy Roosevelt or Thomas Jefferson, and some people would say, um, who would occupy that 5th great position, Woodrow Wilson. It depends. Some people would even say Ronald Reagan. Obviously, even historians and political scientists, long after somebody has occupied the office, still disagree with each other sometimes. And then the near great presidents, there's been some shifting around, but you see Truman and Eisenhower, Reagan perhaps, LBJ perhaps, although LBJ's legacy is very flawed because of the failure of the Vietnam War. And then, so the point being is that uh, whether or not the office is too great for any individual to manage coherently, and that all occupants are too weak for the demands and nature of the office today, I think does partially depend on who's in the office. And and in the same way that historians believe, for instance, that the worst president, there are a couple of competitors for worst president. James Buchanan, the president right before Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1856, and Warren Harding, um, the president elected in 1920, and who actually died and was replaced by Calvin Coolidge. Those two are often considered to be the worst presidents. And but Buchanan was president in 1856 to 1860. Why do historians believe that you have the worst and the greatest president right next to each other? So my point I'm making is this is not just a question of modern demands. This was already 150 years ago, and or 100, yeah, 150 years ago, and or close to it, and you could say that the difference between the worst president and the greatest president, who were right in the same time, were because the way they faced the great contest of the nation, the Civil War. Uh, Buchanan, and remember, you may remember this from our consideration of the Constitution. Remember that people took office in March until the 20th Amendment, which then made Congress and the president begin their terms in January. So Lincoln was elected in 1860 and only took office until March in 1861. Between that time, again, on December 21st, I believe, in 1860, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the country, quickly followed by the other 11 states in the Confederacy. So, my point here is that in December of that year, as the nation began to fall apart and the Union was dissolved, the states seceded. Buchanan essentially said to the nation, there's not much I can do about this. Stop that, please. I'm paraphrasing and parodying at the same time. And let's just say that when Lincoln came into office on March 1st, it would be an understatement to say that his view of the presidential response to the crisis of the nation falling apart was not, please don't do that. Um, uh, and of course, we know how history followed him in that respect. So even within the same time period in the same crisis, you had two different presidents responding in such a way that one earned himself the rating of the worst president ever, and the other earned himself the rating of the greatest president ever. Now, the last major criticism is a complex criticism. This is the one that's presented in the Tullis, Caesar, etc. article, The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency. And that question is the president too powerful? We now have, essentially, as we've seen in our review of the Electoral College and of the party system, we now have essentially a popular means of electing and nominating the president, where candidates have to build in binding extensive primaries, must now compete for popular followings to get elected. That is to say, to get elected to the presidency, you now have to do exactly what the framers kind of feared, which is build a popular following. And the point of the Caesar Tullis piece, The Rise of the Rhetorical President, is the way that the means by which you require a candidate to be elected to the presidency has had an effect, and probably will have more of an intensifying effect on the way that individual governs in the presidency once the election is over. Um, and um, and so the change in the nature of the electoral system, so that it's purely popular now, encouraging just those little arts of popularity that the framers were worried about: issue arousal, uh, image manipulation, the little arts of popularity on which demagoguery is founded. The change in the nomination system, plus the rise of the modern media, which have both expanded the power of the president too to some degree, have made the president too dependent on generating a popular following through constant cheerleading and generating enthusiasm like a cheerleader to be elected, and ultimately too much to govern. Popularity is too transient, these authors suggest, and the framers would agree, for a stable basis for governing. Um, and what about those instances when the president has to go against public opinion? Popular has to do something unpopular. So, in some ways, part of this article argues that the increasing rhetoric on popular appeals and popular persuasion, uh, especially through the mass media, might probably weaken the office and weaken the government. Because the argument is, uh, if you raise people's expectations by generating enthusiasm through popular rhetoric, get people all heated up and expecting you will be able to lower the level of the ocean, or change everything to the better in the United States. Whatever expectations you unleash, remember the presidency does have limitations, and you may not be able to deliver. And sort of like the boy who cried wolf, if you raise people's expectation through excessive rhetoric and enthusiasm, and yet deliver something that can never be delivered, that's bad in terms of creating a certain cynical view of government and its ability to deliver promises. And to some degree, it's become part of our popular presidential culture that all presidential candidates promise a lot, but probably don't deliver what they promise. Again, that's bad, the authors argue of this piece, because it generates cynicism and apathy, because ultimately you'll turn away from what you consider to be false and unproductive and ineffective. Um, and the other thing they argue is that it could weaken the presidency. Again, if the president can only operate by generating popularity, well, there are times when you have to do something that's unpopular for the nation's good. And but then this criticism, interestingly enough, in terms of simply weakening the institutions of government or weakening the presidency, can go in the other direction. So, as you'll see, that question is, can the presidency become a primary threat to the Constitution? And Lincoln suggested that this was possible too. And this is why Lincoln always argued that the president must always exercise presidential power by tracing it back, as Taft suggests and as Burns argues, to um, some notion of constitutional authority. That the president should always essentially base his or her actions on the Constitution, which teaches the people that all proper authority derives from the Constitution. Um, and by the way, connect this with the idea that now we have a purely popular way of nominating and electing the president. And if we did in fact abolish the Electoral College, this would probably increase this tendency of the electoral system to encourage candidates whose primary ability to get elected depends upon their ability to be, as Bryce suggests, as charismatic or magnetic, um, especially if the nation falls into crisis. When the people become desperate, then you could say they may be willing to listen to anybody or anything who can promise an escape from their desperate situation. It's clear that the framers wanted to connect the presidency to public opinion, as we saw in Hamilton's essay on Federalist 68, where he argued, if you remember, when describing the way the Electoral College was supposed to work, that it was important that the sense of the people would operate somehow, but that the actual choice be left to more qualified individuals under a better circumstance, the deliberations of the electors in their state capitals. But of course, the Electoral College did finally become popular on the state level, and as we've already seen, our nomination system is now popular. So, in some ways, uh, the very thing the framers worry about, creating a strong executive and grounding it in public opinion, but too intimately or too constantly, might not only encourage the kind of cynicism we were just talking about and that Caesar and Tullus discussed, when government can't meet the demands of the expectations raised by popular rhetoric and cheerleading, but it could also deprive the president the power to act unpopularly, and worse, begin to pit popular opinion and support against the limitations of the Constitution. In the worst of circumstances, um, in the hands of talented demagogues, encourage the people to prefer dictatorship over presidential, that is to say, constitutional leadership. When you look again, remember that the United States has the oldest and first major modern written constitution. Almost all of the 220 nations in the United Nations today that have constitutional republics or constitutional democracies have imitated, not always, as Chapter 10 of the Wilson text suggests, um, uh, the written constitution, but you could say this: even parliamentary systems rest upon written constitutions, which is to say, the hope of modern government is to channel popular authority through constitutional and institutional means. But uh, if 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 the nomination and election system encourages perhaps media types and charismatic magnetic individuals who you it's not impossible to think that in times of crisis you could get the people to prefer dictatorship over presidential and constitutional leadership. Again, this has been the route that most constitutional governments that have lost their constitutionalism and collapsed into tyranny and dictatorship, this is the way they've taken it, through the executive branch. And you'd have to say that even though our Constitution has lasted for almost 250 years, through tremendous crises, through weak and strong presidencies, effective and ineffective Congresses, and with the separation of powers and checks and balances and the federal system. Um, just because our Constitution has lasted so long, and seems to be so firmly embedded in the minds and attachments of the American people, does not mean that this danger is an impossibility, even for our constitutional system in our day or time, if not today, perhaps 10 years, perhaps 50 years from now. So these are the major criticisms of the evolution of the presidency. Interestingly enough, In some respects, they seem to contradict each other: too strong, too weak, too popular. But under other circumstances, they may coincide uh, to suggest that one of the great and creative institutional creations of the founders, the presidency, under the wrong circumstances, might become its greatest threat.